welcome to another episode of Trident. Today is the first Trident episode to be released in December, so I think it is time to unveil my new Trident winter uniform. There! Now that I got my winter jacket, today we will be talking about the name of the country, Ukraine, known in its native language as Ukraina. I would argue that this is the second most important thing to talk about when introducing you to the country, with the letters that are used to write this name being the only thing more important. After all, the history of the name Ukraine is connected to the country's history in various ways, from the previous names of the country to how the current one arose. In this video, I'll be talking about the country's name and its history. Now, let's begin! The history of Ukraine's names begins at the same time as the earliest predecessors of Ukraine. In the 9th century, the Eastern European lands between the Baltic Sea and the Black Sea were largely inhabited by tribes comprising an ethnic group called the East Slavs. However, they did not form a singular state until the year 862, when an ethnic group called the Rus arrived. Although their origins are subject to some debate, most historians agree that they were a Norse ethnic group, originating in Sweden, that assimilated into the Slavs when they took over. Either way, it is also agreed that the name Rus came from the Old Norse word rods, meaning men who row, because that was how they traveled. This Old Norse word, by the way, is the same root that produced the modern-day Finnish name for Sweden, Ruotsi. Anyway, in the year 879, just a few years after the Rus' arrival into Eastern Europe, the Rus formed a loose federation of principalities under their control. This federation was initially based in the town of Novgorod before moving to Kiev, known as the Mother of Rus cities in 882. Because of this, historians now call this state Kievan Rus. Note, by the way, the term Kiev can be spelled as either Russian-influenced Kiev or the more Ukrainian Kiev. However, since this city recommends spelling itself in the latter way, I will usually be referring to the city as Kiev with a Y-I throughout this series. Anyway, although the term Kievan Rus is used by modern historians to refer to this state, this term did not exist until the 19th century. Instead, at the time, it was referred to by several different names depending on the language. In Old Norse, it was known as Gadariki, a term usually translated as the realm of towns or the kingdom of cities. However, in Old East Slavic, the language of the East Slavs at the time, it was Rusiskaya Zemlya, meaning Rus land, or simply Rus. Meanwhile, the Latin language referred to the state by its most famous name, Russiya. This Latin name is still used by one of the successor states of Rus to this day, while the name of another Rus successor, Belarus, comes from a Russian term meaning white Rus. However, what about the word Ukraine, which bears no resemblance to Rus at all? Well, the term may have come from one of two Old East Slavic terms. The word Ukraine may either have come from the word Ukraina, meaning borderland, as in the borderlands of Rus, or Ukraina, meaning a region or a country. After I filmed the original video, I acquired the Great Book of Ukraine, which appears to provide a third etymology of the word Ukraine, similar to the second theory I just mentioned. On page 3 of the book, Anatoly Jahan notes that in Ukrainian, the word Kraina means a country, while U is a prefix meaning at. Hence, Mr. Jahan translates Ukraina as territory within the country, or the central part of the state, referring to what he called the central region on the map of Kievan Rus. Hence, Ukraine can mean borderland, region, country, or even territory within the country. Now that I have addressed this third etymology, let's get back to the original video. Either way, the first known mention of the term Ukraina was in the year 1187. In that year was the death of one of the local princes, Volodymyr Hlibovich of Pereyaslavl. Because the city of Pereyaslavl protected the southern border of Rus, a historical document written at that time stated that Ukraina groaned for him. This was the first known usage of the term Ukraine in a written document to refer to what we would now call Ukraine. However, for the next few centuries the word Ukraine was not very well defined, with many different lands being referred to as Ukraine. Depending on which map you use, the name Ukraine can apply to either Galicia, which is partially in modern Ukraine but also partially in Poland and Belarus, Pskov, which was located in what is now the Russian-Estonian border, or Ryazan, which is completely Russian. It did not help that the term Ukraine originally referred to the borderlands of Kievan Rus, a state that ceased to exist after a Mongol invasion in 1240, resulting in its constituent monarchies becoming vassals of the Mongol Empire. After that, the lands of what is now Ukraine would be passed between the Mongols, some of the smaller khanates that would replace it, Lithuania, Poland, and a few smaller independent countries formed out of the former Rus principalities. However, as time marched on, the word Ukraine gained a more concrete meaning, with the term beginning to gain its current definition in the 16th, 17th, and 18th centuries. In 1639, a French-Polish cartographer named Guillaume Le Vasseur de Beauplan would create a map of Ukraine that corresponded to what we would now call Ukraine. Many centuries later, a Ukrainian website referred to it as the first descriptive map of Ukraine. 9 years later, in 1648, Beauplan would create a second map titled Delineatio Generalis Camporum Desertorum Vulgo Ukraine. This title translates into English as General Illustration of Desert Plains, in common speech, Ukraine. Outside of mapmaking, Beauplan would also use this term in his 1651 book, Description d'Ukraine. In that book, he would define the land of Ukraine as being located between Russia and Transylvania, which is exactly where you would find Ukraine today. It was during this time that a state began to develop that would bear this name. In 1649, Cossack inhabited lands that were previously ruled by Poland broke away from Poland to form a state which is now known as the Cossack Hetmanate, but which was officially known at the time as the Zaporizhian Host. A Hetmanate was a state ruled by a leader titled Hetman, while the word host referred to both an army of Cossacks and the region that it was located in. Meanwhile, Zaporizhia is a Ukrainian word meaning beyond the rapids, and it's still the name of a Ukrainian city to this day. For most of its history, it was a vassal state of Russia, although it was somewhat self-governing, so it could count as an ancestor to Ukraine. This is also made evident by the fact that the Hetmanate was sometimes unofficially called Ukraine. For instance, the Ottoman Empire referred to the Hetmanate as Ukraina Memleketi, a Turkish phrase meaning the country of Ukraine, while the 1672 Treaty of Buchach, signed by Poland and the Ottomans, used the term Państwo Ukraińskie, which is Polish for the Ukrainian state. Meanwhile, the German cartographer Johann Hohmann called it Ukrainia et terra Cossacorum, a Latin phrase meaning Ukraine or the land of the Cossacks. However, these words Zaporizhia and Ukraine were not the only names used. In fact, other than Zaporizhia, Ukraine, and the Hetmanate, there is a fourth major name used by the Russian government of the time to refer to the state: Little Russia and variants thereof. This English phrase was used to translate the names Malorossiya and Malaya Rossiya. Other than these two terms, there was also a third variation of the name, Malaya Rus, meaning Little Rus. This other name gives a hint into the etymology of both itself and the other two names. The phrases Little Russia and Little Rus implied that the Ukrainians, or Little Russians were part of a larger Russian nation. In fact, during the 18th, 19th, and early 20th centuries, these names are incorporated into the broader ideology of the All-Russian nation, which saw the Russians, Ukrainians, and Belarusians, then called the Great, Little, and White Rus, as part of a singular ethnic group, which sounds like foreshadowing for something? Anyway, this idea of an all-Russian nation is also made evident in the fact that during the 17th century, the official title of the Tsar of Russia was Great Sovereign, Tsar, and Grand Duke of all Great and Little and White Russia. After the Tsardom of Russia was renamed to the Russian Empire in 1721, this title was replaced by the shorter Emperor of all the Russias, which would remain for the rest of the empire's existence. The usage of Russia in a plural form instead of the usual singular form retained the implication that the Tsar was not the ruler of one Russia, but of an empire consisting of 3 Russias: Great Russia, Little Russia, and White Russia. Returning to Ukrainian name history, Russia's relations with the Cossack Hetmanate would result in the former gradually absorbing the latter. From 1708 onward, the autonomy of the Hetmanate was reduced, and although the Hetmanate was not yet dissolved, its lands were simultaneously its land and the land of the Kiev Governorate, a region of the Russian Empire. This strange Hetmanate/Governorate system would last until 1764, when the position of Hetman was abolished and the Kiev Governorate was renamed Little Russia. The same name that the Russian Empire had already used in reference to the Hetmanate was now used to refer to its successor within the empire. Although the Little Russia Governorate would only last until it was divided into smaller governorates in 1781, the name Little Russia would remain in use for the rest of the 18th and 19th centuries. In fact, those of you who know your music would know that Pyotr Tchaikovsky's Symphony No. 2 is nicknamed the Little Russian. That's because it uses 3 folk songs from Ukraine, or Little Russia. However, the phrase Little Russia, and generally the concept of the all-Russian nation, did not go unchallenged, for some events of the early 20th century would cause both to be abandoned by Russians and Ukrainians alike. In March 1917, the February Revolution occurred in Russia, resulting in the last Tsar of Russia being overthrown and a provisional government being installed. At the same time, officials in what was previously called Little Russia established a representative body of their own called the Central Council of Ukraine. In Ukrainian, Ukrainska Centralna Rada. The usage of the term Ukraine in the Central Council's name re-established the usage of this name for the first time since the 18th century. Then, on the 23rd of June the same year, the Central Council would then declare the establishment of an autonomous region within Russia called the Ukrainian People's Republic, UPR, also translated as the Ukrainian National Republic, UNR. However, this autonomy wouldn't last long, for on the 6th of November, the extreme left Bolsheviks overthrew the Russian Republic and established their own government, prompting the Ukrainian People's Republic to declare its independence on the 23rd of January, and leading to a series of events that are a bit too complicated to talk about today, so here's a picture of the various factions involved. Whew, and that was a long sentence. In short, various groups of different political persuasions controlled parts of Ukraine at different points in time, including pro-independence factions, communists backed by Moscow, anti-communist forces of the White Movement from South Russia, and in one area, even anarchists. However, for brevity's sake, we will just focus on a few of the major governments. Although a very large number of rival governments were competing for influence in Ukraine, the UNR continued to exist for most of the next 3 years. In fact, the UNR's existence was only interrupted for 6 months in 1918. On April 29, 1918, conservative Ukrainians backed by the German Empire staged a coup, overthrowing the UNR and creating a new country called the Ukrainian State, also called the Second Hetmanate. This Ukrainian state is generally considered to be a client state of the German Empire. In fact, the Hetmanate was so heavily influenced by Berlin that after World War I ended in November 1918, it would only continue to exist for another month. The state was disestablished on the 13th of December 1918, resulting in the restoration of the UNR. However, the history is not done just yet. While this was happening, the Bolsheviks attempted to establish their own governments in parts of Ukraine. These efforts resulted in various short-lived political entities being established and disestablished from 1917 to 1918. However, these efforts would eventually lead to the establishment of the Ukrainian Socialist Soviet Republic on the 10th of March 1919. On paper, the Ukrainian SSR was an independent country, although its ruling party, the Communist Party of Ukraine, was openly subordinate to Moscow, effectively making this version of Ukraine a satellite state of Moscow. Hence, from this point on, the Ukrainian War of Independence was mainly a competition between the UNR, backed by Poland from 1920, and the Ukrainian SSR, backed by Soviet Russia. This war would continue until 1921, when the UNR was defeated by the Bolsheviks. As part of the Treaty of Riga, signed between Poland and Russia in March 1921, Poland would gain the western parts of Ukraine and Belarus, while the rest would remain independent communist states. However, this independence would have very little significance, for Ukraine and Belarus were still under the influence of Moscow. In fact, just 19 months later, both Ukraine and Belarus would cease to exist as sovereign states. In December 1922, Russia merged with 3 other Soviet republics, Ukraine, Belarus, and Transcaucasia, to form the Soviet Union. In theory, this was supposedly a state representing all of its ethnic groups, but in practice the situation was more complicated, with Moscow switching from encouraging to suppressing non-Russian cultures, depending on who was living in the Kremlin at a given time. Either way, the Ukrainian Socialist Soviet Republic continued to exist, albeit as a republic within the USSR instead of as a country. Therefore, it was during this time that English-speaking sources began referring to the republic as the Ukraine. The definitive article is used to designate a territory as non-sovereign, akin to how Americans talk of the Midwest, the Southwest, the North, the South, and so forth. Anyway, this name of the Ukrainian Socialist Soviet Republic remained in use until 1936, when a new constitution switched the words Socialist and Soviet. After that point, the newly renamed Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic would retain that name for another 55 years. During this time, it did a lot of different things, including undergoing a great purge, re-annexing western Ukraine from Poland at the beginning of World War II, getting occupied by Germany, establishing resistance movements against that occupation, being liberated by the USSR in 1944, joining the 60th Army in liberating Auschwitz and other concentration camps, taking a picture of a flag in Berlin, becoming a founding member of the UN the same year, because the USSR wanted 3 General Assembly seats, producing 2 Soviet leaders that were connected to Ukraine in some way, acquiring the Crimean Peninsula, whose economy was apparently already linked to Ukraine's anyways, as a gift from Russia in 1954, and undergoing what I heard be described as a social and economic stagnation, which makes sense since I cannot think of too many major events in Ukrainian history from this time. There was the meltdown of a certain nuclear power plant in 1986, and there was also the Soviet war in Afghanistan, when 25% of Russian troops are Ukrainians, but apart from that... Wait! Have we wandered off topic? Where were we? Right, Ukraine's name and history. Throughout all of this time, Ukraine remained known as the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic. However, in the late 1980s and early 1990s, the Soviet central government began to reform itself, with the republics gaining more power during this time. In fact, throughout the 1990 to 1991 period, the Ukrainian SSR government legalized non-communist parties, held elections involving them in March 1990, and issued the Declaration of State Sovereignty of Ukraine by a near unanimous vote of the Supreme Soviet, the Parliament of Ukraine at the time. This declaration, adopted on the 16th of July 1990, resulted in Ukrainian laws holding precedence over Soviet laws on Ukrainian territory, created an army and a national bank, and generally loosened Ukraine's association with Moscow. However, this was not a declaration of independence. That would only come on the 24th of August 1991, when in response to a failed coup by Soviet hardliners in Moscow a few days prior, the Supreme Soviet of the Ukrainian SSR issued its last Soviet-era act, the Declaration of Independence of Ukraine, which formally proclaimed the Ukrainian SSR to be an independent state. The Supreme Soviet subsequently became the Verkhovna Rada, which is essentially a translation of the former term, while many other aspects of the Ukrainian political system were modified. This would inevitably include the state's name. Therefore, the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic was renamed to simply Ukraine, without any "the" before it or Soviet after it. The elimination of the "the" is significant, since by that time, the definitive article in the Ukraine had become associated with Russian and especially Soviet rule over Ukraine. Therefore, the removal of the "the" from the short name, as well as the abandoning of the phrase Soviet Socialist Republic, indicates that Ukraine is now an independent country. A few months after the Ukrainian Declaration of Independence, an independence referendum was held on the 1st of December 1991 in order to confirm the aforementioned change in Ukraine's status. In that referendum, 92.26% of Ukrainians voted in favor of approving Ukrainian independence. Even the heavily Russian-inhabited areas of Crimea voted in favor of Ukrainian independence from the USSR. After Ukrainian independence was overwhelmingly confirmed by voters, foreign governments began to recognize the legitimacy of this newly independent country. In fact, just 2 days after the referendum was held, Ukraine was already recognized by the governments of Poland, Canada, and even Russia itself. This last one is quite remarkable since Russia hadn't yet declared its independence from the USSR. By the 22nd of December, or just 3 weeks after the referendum, Ukrainian independence was already recognized by 19 foreign governments, including 12 fully recognized countries, 5 former Soviet republics, and 2 former republics within Yugoslavia. One government that did not recognize Ukrainian independence at first was the government of the Soviet Union itself, which technically continued to consider the Ukrainian SSR as part of its territory. However, what the Soviet government did or did not consider to be part of its territory rapidly became less and less relevant, because by the time the Ukrainian referendum was held, the scope of Soviet law was effectively reduced to just Russia and Kazakhstan, and even they would succeed on the 12th and the 16th of December, respectively. Finally, on the 26th of December 1991, the Council of the Republics of the USSR voted to formally end the USSR's existence, and with that last resolution, any remaining legal questions on Ukraine's status was resolved in Ukraine's favor. Ukraine was now a fully recognized state, and the word Ukraine had finally secured its position as the one official name for that state. That is the history of Ukraine's name. Now, on to the outro. And now you know more about the name of Ukraine. In this video, we have learned about how the word Ukraine went from being a mere designator of a borderland to the name of Europe's second largest country, all the while outlasting other names like Rus and Malorossiya. To summarize, this country is called Ukraine and its people are called Ukrainians. They speak Ukrainian, have Ukrainian citizenship, and vote in elections to a Ukrainian government and a Ukrainian parliament, or Verkhovna Rada. This country is not called the Ukraine, nor are they Little Russia, nor are they any other variant of the latter phrase. Looking at the history of Ukraine's names also gives us some insight into the history of Ukraine itself. Charting the names of Ukraine highlights how its lands have shifted from country to country throughout the centuries, beginning with Kievan Rus more than 1,000 years ago, and ending with the creation of the current Ukrainian country in 1991. In a way, this video about the word Ukraine is not just about a word, but also the history of the country itself. Many of the events that I mentioned in this video, including those not directly relating to the country's name, will be important for future episodes of this series. Until then, I'm Jonathan, and this has been Trident.